April Glasgow reporting. The softball field was officially named after softball stalwart Mr. E. Walwyn Brewley on July 15, 2016. Acting Director of the Department of Youth Affairs and Sports and Event Chair Mrs. Brenda Letsum-Tai began the event by highlighting Mr. Brewley's contributions to softball in the territory.
Mr. Brewley started playing softball while still in high school in the 1950s as a member of the BVI Secondary School Panthers. After high school, he joined the Titleys Tigers of Rowtown and later joined the Marlins and the Blue Wings teams, respectively, where he honed his skills as pitcher. Mr. Carlos Downing, the then commissioner of softball, learned that Brewley could score and keep stats, and his path was forever changed. The manager of the Blue Wings asked Brewley to score for them, which soon led to his taking on the task of scoring for the entire league in 1971. Since 1967, Mr. Brewley has performed as player, official scorer, statistician, announcer, treasurer, vice president, and president of the BVI Amateur Softball Association. He was the longest-serving president of amateur softball in the English-speaking Caribbean. Regionally and internationally, Mr. Brewley led the BVI delegation to numerous Central American and Caribbean Confederation Congresses, International Softball Federation Congresses, and attended Pan American Confederation of Amateur Softball Congresses. Mr. E. Brewley's dedication and contribution to the development of softball in the territory was recognized by the International Softball Federation, who inducted him into the International Softball Federation's Hall of Fame on the 17th of June, 2000. He is the only member of the BVI Amateur Softball Association to receive such an honor. And we are very pleased tonight to honor him by naming the old recreation grounds officially the E. Walwyn Brewley Ballpark.
Premier of the Virgin Islands, Dr. the Honorable D. Orlando Smith, OBE, told of personal anecdotes shared with Mr. Brewley over the years.
Walwyn and I go back a long way from the time we were young lads in school. And in many ways, you can say that I followed in his footsteps. In the high school, the BVI High School at that time, Mr. Brewley was one of two persons in the first ever sixth form class in the British Virgin Islands, right? And then I followed him just a couple of years later, and I again was one of two persons in the second sixth form class in the British Virgin Islands. After Mr. Walwyn Brewley had gone to university, got education, etc., he got involved in politics and he represented the 4th District here for many years. And I also followed him in that direction and got involved in politics and representing the entire territory for a few years now. So I want to thank him for his leadership. And I want to also thank him for his leadership in softball.
Representative of the 4th District and Minister for Communications and Works, Honorable Mark Vanterpool, and Minister for Education and Culture, Honorable Myron V. Walwyn, both gave high praises to the honoree.
Softball is synonymous with the name E. Walwyn Brewley. If you agree with me, let me hear a round of applause. Without a doubt, this is a gentleman, not just whose name, not just whose pen on the scorecards as he would be speaking, but especially a gentleman whose voice rang out throughout this district on many occasions, morning, noon, and night, as he dedicated a lot of his life, I'm not exaggerating, a lot of his life, in thick and in thin, when no one was here and when many were here. E. Walwyn Brewley stood in that booth and many other booths to be here to support, score, announce for softball. I want to say give him a big round of applause. We also must remember that E. Walwyn Brewley was not just an organizer and the president and all the other good accolades that he has been for softball here in the Virgin Islands. But right here on this mound, I have witnessed many times this gentleman hurling the ball in as he pitched softball here in the Virgin Islands. I don't know how many wins he have on his scorecard, but he was always there. So give him a round of applause as a good player for the Blue Wings, E. Walwyn Brewley. In fact, I recall many times when he thought he had retired from pitching, when he was called up at the last moment to pitch and fit in for the Blue Wings, and he never refused the call. He was always retiring, but never retired. In fact, even up to now, he is always retiring, but E. Walwyn Brewley continues to do a Herculean task for sports in the territory, and especially for softball. E. Walwyn Brewley deserves a round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. I want to thank him.
E. Walwyn Brewley, known to generations of Virgin Islanders simply as GM, has been a patriot of these great Virgin Islands and has served this country well in many capacities, with the highlight of his service being that of a legislator for many years, and also serving as the Minister for Communication and Works in the government of the Virgin Islands. Though he ascended to such a high office, this very humble and down-to-earth gentleman has contributed significantly to the development of the sport of softball in this country, both as a player and as an announcer. And as you know, the announcer keeps you engaged and as entertained as the players do. I cannot imagine softball in the Virgin Islands without the voice of GM. As a boy, I can remember his distinctive voice calling the games as I played baseball on this very field, and as the older men and women played softball. GM is the voice of softball in this country, and his voice is as synonymous with this sport in the Virgin Islands as the voices of the great Vin Scully and the great Harry Carey for Major League Baseball. Mr. Brewley, on behalf of the government and the people of the Virgin Islands, we thank you for your years of service to this country through sports.
The honoree, Mr. Brewley, told his story in his response.
The first softball club that I played on was at high school. And that included people like the former Deputy Governor Elton Georges, Dr. Quincy Lettsome, Mr. Milton Cricky, who was the catcher, Eliu Reimer, Dr. Marvin Flax, the late Andrew Cito, Fred, and some others. But we played, and we played pretty good because we played with the youngsters who were not in high school at the time, but were of similar age. And then I went on from when I left high school, I started playing with the Tigers. And I played for them for a few years, and I switched from the Tigers. I played with the Blue Wings. And it was during my Blue Wings time, one day when I wasn't pitching, the manager of the Blue Wings at the time, Charles Mercer, he pushed a scorebook in my hand and he says, you know how to score this thing? I said, well, I never scored any softball. Because in those days, well, you could call it we played, but it was kind of bush league because nobody really scored and kept any kind of, at the end of the game who won and by what score. But scorebooks, nobody took time to learn to do it. So in between, when I wasn't pitching, I started scoring for the Blue Wings, and then I started keeping stats for the Blue Wings. So the Blue Wings Softball Club was the first club in this country to have proper stats done. And lo and behold, when Mr. Callis Dowden, who was a mover and shaker in softball, he was the first commissioner of softball. He was the editor of the Island Sun. But if you had anything to do concerning softball and you walked into the Island Sun office, Mr. Downing will put aside whatever he was doing, and then he would sit down and say, well, let's get down to the softball business first before, and then my work will come after. So Mr. Dowden and Gaston Penn, who was the then president, approached me, I think, when the Jets and the Marlins played the first championship series between those two clubs, and said, well, we understand you keep stats. I said, yeah, I keep stats, but for the Blue Wings. They said, well, we need somebody to keep the stats for this championship series. So I started keeping stats up. That was my first time turning out stats for any team besides the Blue Wings Softball Club. And at the end of the time, well, the Jets was a young, strong team, and nobody expected them to, but they beat the Marlins in that championship series. And after that, well, the rest of keeping stats and whatnot is history. I then became the statistician for the whole league. And at that time, the league had maybe 14 to 16 teams, because we had two divisions, an East Division and a West Division. That's when teams played in the village where they came from. Most Blue Wing players, all Blue Wing players were from Boggers Bay and maybe Purcell. All the Atoms were from Eastern Long Look. All the Birds were from Seacoast Bay, and the Rams, which later became the Royals, they came from over the hill, Brewers Bay, Mears, and so forth. And then you had the Rockets out of Bellevue. And I started out as a member of the then association as a statistician. And over the years, not too many years, I was vice president. Then I became president, and I got stuck. Because every year I would say, well, this is my last year. You all have to find somebody else. And every year, I couldn't leave. The thing about it, even when I became a politician, when I ran for political office and I won, people said, well, gee, I'm gone this time. And I said, no, I'm not going any place. As long as I'm on the island, I am still going to come here on the weekends, and I'm going to do what I am accustomed to doing.
The ceremony wrapped up by the premier presenting Mr. Brewley with a plaque and the first pitch on the renamed field by the honoree. The E. Walwyn Brewley Ballpark is managed by the Recreation Trust, an associated agency of the Ministry of Education and Culture. Creating a culture of excellence is the Ministry of Education and Culture. I'm April Glasgow. Thank you for watching today's program.